Dan Cooper was the alias of an unidentified man who hijacked Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, a Boeing 727 aircraft flying from Portland, Oregon, to Seattle, Washington, on November 24, 1971. Cooper told the flight crew he had a bomb and demanded $200,000 in ransom, equivalent to $1,600,000 in 2024, and 4 parachutes upon landing in Seattle. After releasing the passengers in Seattle, Cooper directed the crew to refuel the aircraft and begin a second flight to Mexico City, with a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada. After taking off from Seattle, Cooper opened the aircraft's aft door, deployed the air stair and parachuted to an uncertain fate over a remote, heavily wooded area of southwest Washington. Because of a reporter's error, the hijacker became known as D.B. Cooper. The hijacker's true identity and fate remain unknown. In 1980, a small portion of the ransom money, $5,800, was found along the riverbanks of the Columbia River near Vancouver, Washington. The discovery of the money renewed public interest in the crime, but yielded no additional information, and the remaining money was never recovered. For 45 years after the hijacking, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, maintained an active investigation and built an extensive case file, but did not reach any definitive conclusions about Cooper's identity. The FBI officially suspended active investigation of the case in 2016, although journalists, professional investigators and amateur sleuths continue to pursue numerous theories for Cooper's identity and ultimate fate. Cooper's hijacking, and several imitators in the year after, prompted immediate and major upgrades to security measures for airports and commercial aviation. Metal detectors were installed at airports, baggage inspection became mandatory, and passengers who paid cash for tickets on the day of departure were selected for additional scrutiny. The Cooper hijacking remains the only documented unsolved case of air piracy in the history of commercial aviation. On November 24, 1971, Thanksgiving Eve, a man approached the flight counter for Northwest Orient Airlines at Portland International Airport. Using cash, the man bought a one-way ticket on Flight 305, a 30-minute trip north to Seattle-Tacoma International Airport, SeaTac. On his ticket, the man listed his name as Dan Cooper. Eyewitnesses described Cooper as a white male in his mid-40s, with dark hair and brown eyes, wearing a black or brown business suit, a white shirt, a thin black tie, a black raincoat and brown shoes. 294 carrying a black attaché case and a brown paper bag. 294 Cooper boarded Flight 305, a Boeing 727-100, FAA registration N467 US. Cooper took seat 18E in the last row and ordered a drink, a bourbon and 7-Up from a flight attendant. With a crew of 6, consisting of Captain William A. Scott, First Officer William Bill J. Radachak, Flight Engineer Harold E. Anderson and Flight Attendants Alice Hancock, Tina Mucklow and Florence Schaffner, and 36 passengers aboard, including Cooper, Flight 305 left Portland on schedule at 2:50 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper handed a note to flight attendant Schaffner, who was sitting in the jump seat at the rear of the airplane, directly behind Cooper. Assuming the note was a lonely businessman's telephone number, Schaffner dropped the note unopened into her purse. Cooper then leaned toward her and whispered, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." Schaffner opened the note. In neat, all-capital letters printed with a felt tip pen, Cooper had written, "Miss, I have a bomb in my briefcase and want you to sit by me." Schaffner returned the note to Cooper, sat down as he requested and asked quietly to see the bomb. He opened his attaché case, and she saw 2 rows of 4 red cylinders, which she assumed were dynamite. Attached to the cylinders were a wire and a large, cylindrical battery, which resembled a bomb. Cooper closed the briefcase and told Schaffner his demands. She wrote a note with Cooper's demands, brought it to the cockpit and informed the flight crew of the situation. Captain Scott directed Schaffner to remain in the cockpit for the remainder of the flight and take notes of events as they happened. He then relayed to Northwest Flight Operations in Minnesota the hijacker's demands. Cooper requests $200,000 in a knapsack by 5 p.m. He wants 2 front parachutes, 2 back parachutes. He wants the money in negotiable American currency. By requesting 2 sets of parachutes, Cooper implied he planned to take a hostage with him, thereby discouraging authorities from supplying non-functional equipment. With Schaffner in the cockpit, flight attendant Mucklow sat next to Cooper to act as a liaison between him and the flight crew. Cooper made additional demands through Mucklow. Upon landing at SeaTac, fuel trucks were to meet the plane and all passengers were to remain seated while Mucklow brought the money aboard. He said he would release the passengers after he had the money. The last items brought aboard would be the 4 parachutes. Scott informed SeaTac Air Traffic Control of the situation, who contacted the Seattle Police Department, SPD, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The passengers were told their arrival in Seattle would be delayed because of a minor mechanical difficulty. Donald Nyrop, the president of Northwest at the time, authorized payment of the ransom and ordered all employees to cooperate with the hijacker and comply with his demands. For approximately 2 hours, Flight 305 circled Puget Sound in a holding pattern to give the SPD and the FBI sufficient time to assemble Cooper's ransom money and parachutes, and to mobilize emergency personnel. On board the aircraft, Cooper demanded Mucklow remain by his side at all times. Mucklow later said Cooper appeared familiar with the local terrain. While looking out the window, he remarked, "Looks like Tacoma down there," as the aircraft flew above it. When told the parachutes were coming from McChord Air Force Base, Cooper correctly noted McChord was only a 20-minute drive from SeaTac. She later described the hijacker's demeanor. Cooper was not nervous. He seemed rather nice and he was not cruel or nasty. While the aircraft continued circling Seattle, Mucklow chatted with Cooper and asked why he chose Northwest Airlines to hijack. He laughed and replied, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge," then explained the flight simply suited his needs. Cooper asked where Mucklow was from. She answered she was originally from Pennsylvania but was living in Minneapolis at the time. He responded that Minnesota was very nice country. Mucklow asked where Cooper was from, but he became upset and refused to answer. He asked if she smoked and offered her a cigarette. She replied she had quit, but accepted the cigarette. FBI records note Cooper spoke briefly to an unidentified passenger while the aircraft maintained its holding pattern over Seattle. In his interview with FBI agents, passenger George Lebissonier stated he visited the restroom directly behind Cooper on several occasions. After one visit, Lebissonier said the path to his seat was blocked by a passenger wearing a cowboy hat, questioning Mucklow about the supposed mechanical problem delaying them. Lebissonier said Cooper was initially amused by the interaction, then became irritated and told the man to return to his seat, but the cowboy ignored Cooper and continued to question Mucklow. Lebissonier claimed he eventually persuaded the cowboy to return to his seat. Mucklow's version of the interaction differed from Lebissonier's. She said a passenger approached her and asked for a sports magazine to read because he was bored. She and the passenger moved to an area directly behind Cooper, where they both looked for magazines. The passenger took a copy of The New Yorker and returned to his seat. When Mucklow returned to sit with Cooper, he said, "If that is a sky marshal, I don't want any more of that," but she reassured him there were no sky marshals on the flight. Despite his brief interaction with Cooper, the cowboy was not interviewed by the FBI and was never identified. The $200,000 ransom was received from Seattle First National Bank in a bag weighing approximately 19 pounds, 8.5 kilograms. The money, 10,000 unmarked $20 bills, most of which had serial numbers beginning with L, indicating issuance by the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, was photographed on microfilm by the FBI. The SPD obtained the 2 front, reserve, parachutes from a local skydiving school and the 2 back, main, parachutes from a local stunt pilot. Around 5:24 Pacific Standard Time, Captain Scott was informed the parachutes had been delivered to SeaTac and notified Cooper they would be landing soon. At 5:46 Pacific Standard Time, Flight 305 landed at SeaTac. With Cooper's permission, Scott parked the aircraft on a partially lit runway, away from the main terminal. Cooper demanded only one representative of the airline approach the plane with the parachutes and money, and the only entrance and exit would be through the aircraft's front door via boarding stairs. Northwest Seattle Operations Manager, Al Lee, was designated to be the courier. To avoid the possibility Cooper might mistake Lee's airline uniform for a law enforcement officer, he changed into civilian clothes for the task. With the passengers remaining seated, a ground crew attached a boarding stair. Per Cooper's directive, Mucklow exited the aircraft through the front door and retrieved the bag containing the ransom money. When she returned, she carried the bag past the seated passengers to Cooper in the last row. Cooper then agreed to release the passengers. As they disembarked, Cooper inspected the money. In an attempt to break the tension, Mucklow jokingly asked Cooper if she could have some of it. Cooper readily agreed and handed her a packet of bills, but she immediately returned the money and explained accepting gratuities was against company policy. She said Cooper had tried to tip her and the other 2 flight attendants earlier in the flight with money from his pocket, but they had each declined, citing the policy. With the passengers safely disembarked, only Cooper and the 6 crew members remained aboard. In accordance with his demands, Mucklow made 3 trips outside the aircraft to retrieve the parachutes, which she brought to him in the rear of the plane. While Mucklow brought aboard the parachutes, Schaffner asked Cooper if she could retrieve her purse, stored in a compartment behind his seat. Cooper agreed and told her, "I won't bite you." Flight attendant Hancock then asked Cooper if the flight attendants could leave, to which he replied, "Whatever you girls would like," so Hancock and Schaffner disembarked. When Mucklow brought the final parachute to Cooper, she gave him printed instructions for using the parachutes, but Cooper said he didn't need them. A problem with the refueling process caused a delay, so a second truck and then a third were brought to the aircraft to complete the refueling. During the delay, Mucklow said Cooper complained the money was delivered in a cloth bag instead of a knapsack as he had directed, and he now had to improvise a new way to transport the money. Using a pocket knife, he cut the canopy from one of the reserve parachutes and stuffed some of the money into the empty parachute bag. An Federal Aviation Administration (FAA) official requested a face-to-face meeting with Cooper aboard the aircraft, but Cooper denied the request. Cooper became impatient, saying, "This shouldn't take so long," and, "Let's get this show on the road." He then gave the cockpit crew his flight plan and directives: a southeast course toward Mexico City at the minimum airspeed possible without stalling the aircraft, approximately 100 knots, 185 km per hour, 115 miles per hour, at a maximum 10,000 foot, 3,000 meters altitude. Cooper also instructed that the landing gear remain deployed, the wing flaps be lowered 15 degrees and the cabin remain unpressurized. First Officer Radachak informed Cooper that the configuration limited the aircraft's range to about 1,000 miles, 1,600 kilometers, so a second refueling would be necessary before entering Mexico. Cooper and the crew discussed options, agreeing on Reno-Tahoe International Airport as the refueling stop. Cooper further directed the aircraft take off with the aft exit door open and its air stair extended. Northwest officials objected for reasons of safety, but Cooper countered by saying, "It can be done, do it," but then did not insist and said he would lower the air stair himself once they were airborne. Cooper demanded Mucklow remain aboard to assist the operation. Around 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off, with only Cooper, Mucklow, Scott, Radachak and flight engineer Anderson aboard. 2 F-106 fighters from McChord Air Force Base and a Lockheed T-33 trainer, diverted from an unrelated Air National Guard mission, followed the 727. All 3 jets maintained flight patterns to stay behind the slow-moving 727 and out of Cooper's view. After takeoff, Cooper instructed Mucklow to lower the aft air stair. Mucklow told him and the flight crew she feared being sucked out of the aircraft. The flight crew suggested she come to the cockpit and retrieve an emergency rope with which she could tie herself to a seat. Cooper rejected the suggestion, stating he did not want her going up front or the flight crew coming back to the cabin. Mucklow continued to express her fear to Cooper, asking that he cut some cord from one of the parachutes to create a safety line for her. Cooper said he would lower the air stair, instructed her to go to the cockpit, close the curtain partition between the coach and first-class sections and not return. Before she left, Mucklow begged Cooper, please take the bomb with you." Cooper responded that he would either disarm it or take it with him. As Mucklow walked to the cockpit and turned to close the curtain partition, she saw Cooper standing in the aisle tying what appeared to be the money bag around his waist. From takeoff to when Mucklow entered the cockpit, 4 to 5 minutes had elapsed. For the rest of the flight to Reno, Mucklow remained in the cockpit and was the last person to see Cooper. Around 8 p.m., a cockpit warning light flashed, indicating the air stair had been deployed. Scott and Radachak used the plane's intercom to ask Cooper if he needed assistance, but Cooper declined. The crew's ears popped from the drop in air pressure from the aft exit door being opened. At approximately 8:13 p.m., the aircraft's tail section suddenly pitched upward, forcing the pilots to trim and return the aircraft to level flight. In his interview with the FBI, Radachak said the sudden upward pitch occurred while the flight was near Portland's northern suburbs. With the aft exit door open and its air stair deployed, the flight crew remained in the cockpit, unsure if Cooper was still aboard. Mucklow used the intercom to inform Cooper they were approaching Reno and that he needed to raise the air stair so the airplane could land safely. She repeated her requests as the pilots made the final approach to land, but neither Mucklow nor the flight crew received a reply from Cooper. At 11:02 p.m., with the air stair still deployed, Flight 305 landed at Reno-Tahoe International Airport. FBI agents, state troopers, sheriff's deputies and Reno police established a perimeter around the aircraft but, fearing the hijacker and the bomb were still aboard, did not approach the plane. Scott searched the cabin, confirmed Cooper was no longer aboard and, after a 30-minute search, an FBI bomb squad declared the cabin safe. In addition to 66 latent fingerprints aboard the plane, FBI agents recovered Cooper's black clip-on tie clip and 2 of the 4 parachutes, one of which had been opened and had 3 shroud lines cut from the canopy. Investigators interviewed eyewitnesses in Portland, Seattle and Reno, and developed a series of composite sketches. Local and federal authorities immediately began questioning possible suspects. In a rush to meet a deadline, reporter James Long of the Oregon Journal recorded the name, Dan Cooper, as D.B. Cooper. United Press International Wire Service reporter Clyde Jabin republished Long's error, and as other media sources repeated the error, the name, D.B. Cooper, stuck. Acting on the possibility the hijacker may have used his real name, or the same alias in a previous crime, Portland police discovered and interviewed a local resident named D.B. Cooper. The Portland Cooper had a minor police record, but was quickly eliminated as a suspect. Due to the number of variables and parameters, precisely defining the area to search was difficult. The 727's airspeed estimates varied, the environmental conditions along the flight path varied with the aircraft's location and altitude, and only Cooper knew how long he remained in free fall before pulling his ripcord. The F-106 pilots neither saw anyone jumping from the airliner, nor did their radar detect a deployed parachute. A black-clad man jumping into the moonless night would be difficult to see, especially given the limited visibility, cloud cover and lack of ground lighting. The T-33 pilots did not make visual contact with the 727. On December 6, 1971, 12 days after the incident, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover approved the use of a United States Air Force State Route 71 Blackbird to retrace and photograph Flight 305's flight path, and attempt to locate the items Cooper carried during his jump. The State Route 71 made 5 flights to retrace Flight 305's route, but due to poor visibility, the photography attempts were unsuccessful. In an experimental recreation, flying the same aircraft used in the hijacking in the same flight configuration, FBI agents pushed a 200-pound, 91-kilogram, sled out of the aft air stair and were able to reproduce the upward motion of the tail section and brief change in cabin pressure described by the flight crew at 8:13 p.m. Initial extrapolations placed Cooper's landing zone within an area on the southernmost outreach of Mount St. Helens, a few miles southeast of Ariel, Washington, near Lake Merwin, an artificial lake formed by a dam on the Lewis River. Search efforts concentrated on Clark and Cowlitz counties, encompassing the terrain immediately south and north of the Lewis River in southwest Washington. FBI agents and sheriff's deputies searched large areas of the largely forested terrain on foot and by helicopter. Door-to-door searches of local farmhouses were also performed. Other search parties ran patrol boats along Lake Merwin and Yale Lake, the reservoir immediately to its east. Neither Cooper nor any of the equipment he presumably carried were found. Using fixed-wing aircraft and helicopters from the Oregon Army National Guard, the FBI coordinated an aerial search along the entire flight path, known as Victor 23 in U.S. aviation terminology, and as Vector 23 inches in most Cooper literature, from Seattle to Reno. Although numerous broken treetops and several pieces of plastic and other objects resembling parachute canopies were sighted and investigated, nothing relevant to the hijacking was found. Soon after the spring thaw in early 1972, teams of FBI agents aided by some 200 soldiers from Fort Lewis, along with Air Force personnel, National Guardsmen and civilian volunteers, conducted another thorough ground search of Clark and Cowlitz counties for 18 days in March, and then another 18 days in April. Electronic Explorations Company, a marine salvage firm, used a submarine to search the 200-foot, 61 meters, depths of Lake Merwin. 2 local women stumbled upon a skeleton in an abandoned structure in Clark County. It was later identified as the remains of Barbara Ann Derry, a teenage girl believed to have been abducted and murdered several weeks earlier by Warren Forrest, a suspected serial killer. Ultimately, the extensive search and recovery operation uncovered no significant material evidence related to the hijacking. Based on early computer projections produced for the FBI, Cooper's drop zone was first estimated to be between the Lewis River Dam to the north and the town of Battleground, Washington, to the south. In March 1972, after a joint investigation with Northwest Orient Airlines and the Air Force, the FBI determined Cooper probably jumped over the city of La Center, Washington. In 2019, the FBI released a report detailing the burglary of a grocery store, about 3 hours after Cooper jumped, near Hyson, Washington. Hyson, an unincorporated community, was within the calculated drop zone Northwest Orient Airlines presented to the FBI. In the report, the FBI noted the burglar took only survival items, such as beef jerky and gloves. However, the report notes that the burglar wore military-type boots with a corrugated, sole, while Cooper was described as wearing slip-on shoes. Based on the evidence and Cooper's tactics, the FBI speculated Cooper planned the hijacking carefully using detailed, specific knowledge of aviation, the local terrain and the Boeing 727's capabilities. Cooper chose a seat in the last row of the rear cabin for 3 reasons: to observe and respond to any action in front of him, to minimize the possibility of being approached or attacked by someone behind him, and to make himself less conspicuous to the rest of the passengers. To ensure he would not be deliberately supplied with sabotaged equipment, Cooper demanded 4 parachutes to force the assumption he might compel 1 or more hostages to jump with him. Himmelsbach noted Cooper's choice of a bomb, instead of other weapons previously used by hijackers, thwarted any multidirectional attempts to rush him. Cooper was careful to avoid leaving evidence. Before he jumped, Cooper demanded Mucklow return to him all notes either written by him or on his behalf. Mucklow said she used the last match in his paper matchbook to light one of his cigarettes, and when she attempted to dispose of the empty matchbook, he demanded she return it to him. Although Cooper meticulously attempted to retrieve evidence, he left his clip-on tie in his seat. Cooper was clearly familiar with the Boeing 727's capabilities and confidential features, but the aircraft's design was the primary reason Cooper chose the aircraft. With its aft air stair and the placement of its 3 engines, the 727 was one of the only passenger jets from which a parachute jump could be easily made. Mucklow told the FBI that Cooper appeared to be familiar with the 727's typical refueling time and procedures. By specifying a 15 degrees flap setting, Cooper displayed specific knowledge of aviation tactics and the Boeing 727's capabilities. Unlike most commercial jet airliners, the 727 could remain in slow, low-altitude flight without stalling. The flap setting Cooper specifically requested allowed him to control the 727's airspeed and altitude without entering the cockpit, where he could have been overpowered by the 3 pilots. First Officer Radichak, who spoke with Cooper on the intercom during the hijacking, told the FBI, Cooper displayed a specific knowledge of flying an aircraft in general. The most significant knowledge Cooper displayed was a feature both secret and unique to the 727. The aft air stair could be operated during flight, and the single activation switch in the rear of the cabin could not be overridden from the cockpit. Cooper knew how to operate the air stair, and had clearly planned to use it for his escape. The FBI speculated Cooper knew the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, was using 727s to drop agents and supplies into enemy territory during the Vietnam War. Since no situation on a passenger flight would necessitate such an operation, civilian crews were neither informed the air stair could be lowered mid-flight, nor were they aware its operation could not be overridden from the cockpit. Cooper appeared to be familiar with parachutes, although his experience level is unknown. Mucklow said Cooper appeared to be completely familiar with the parachutes which had been furnished to him, and told a journalist, Cooper put on his parachute as though he did so every day. Cooper's familiarity with the military-style parachutes he was given has resulted in speculation that Cooper was a military parachutist and not a civilian skydiver. Larry Carr, who directed the investigative team from 2006 to 2009, does not believe Cooper was a paratrooper. Instead, Carr speculates Cooper had been an Air Force aircraft cargo loader. An aircraft cargo loading assignment would provide him with aviation knowledge and experience. Cargo loaders have basic jump training, wear emergency parachutes and know how to dispatch items from planes in flight. As a cargo loader, Cooper would be familiar with parachutes, but not necessarily sufficient knowledge to survive the jump he made. From the beginning of their investigation, the FBI speculated Cooper did not survive his jump for several reasons: Cooper's apparent lack of skydiving experience, his lack of proper equipment for his jump and survival, the temperature and inclement weather on the night of the hijacking, the wooded terrain into which Cooper jumped, his lack of knowledge of his landing area and the unused ransom money. First, Cooper appeared to lack the necessary skydiving knowledge, skills and experience for the type of jump he attempted. Carr said, "We originally thought Cooper was an experienced jumper, perhaps even a paratrooper." He further said, "We concluded after a few years this was simply not true. No experienced parachutist would have jumped in the pitch-black night, in the rain, with a 172 miles per hour, 77 meters per second, wind in his face wearing loafers and a trench coat. It was simply too risky." Alternatively, skydiving instructor Earl Coffe, who supplied the parachutes, testified Cooper would not have needed extensive experience to survive the jump, and anyone who had 6 or 7 practice jumps could accomplish this. However, Coffe also noted jumping at night drastically increased the risk of injury, and without jump boots Cooper would probably have suffered severe ankle or leg injuries upon landing. Second, Cooper did not appear to have the equipment necessary for either his jump or his survival in the wilderness. He neither brought nor requested a helmet, and jumped into a 15 degrees Fahrenheit, -9 degrees Celsius, wind at 10,000 feet, 3,000 meters, in November over Washington without proper protection against the extreme wind chill. However, what Cooper was wearing at the time of his jump is unknown. In addition to his attaché case, Cooper carried a paper bag witnesses described as approximately 4 inches tall and slightly smaller, while lying flat, than the width and length of the case. Because Cooper did not use the contents of the bag during any part of the hijacking, the FBI speculated the bag may have contained equipment for his jump, such as boots, gloves and goggles. Third, Cooper did not have an accomplice waiting on the ground to help him escape. Such an arrangement would have required both a precisely timed jump and the flight crew's cooperation to follow a predetermined flight path, but Cooper did not give the flight crew a specific path. Moreover, when the flight crew proposed, and Cooper agreed, to alter the flight path and fly from Seattle to Reno for refueling, Cooper had no way of keeping an accomplice apprised of his changed plans. The low cloud cover and lack of visibility to the ground further complicated Cooper's ability to determine his location, establish a bearing or see his landing zone. Finally, the ransom money was never spent, and the recovered portion was found unused. Carr said, "Diving into the wilderness without a plan, without the right equipment, in such terrible conditions, he probably never even got his chute open." FBI agent Richard Tosaw theorized Cooper landed in the Columbia River and drowned. Other FBI agents believed Cooper survived. A senior FBI agent anonymously opined in a 1976 article in the Seattle Times, "I think Cooper made it. I think he slept in his own bed that night. It was a clear night. A lot of the country is pretty flat, he could have just walked out. Right down the road. Hell, they weren't even looking for him there at the time. They thought he was somewhere else. He could just walk down the road." In the months after Cooper's hijacking, 5 men attempted copycat hijackings, and all 5 survived their parachute escapes. Himmelsbach cited 3 examples of hijackers who survived jumps in conditions similar to Cooper's escape: Martin McNally, Frederick Hahnman and Richard LaPointe. McNally jumped using only a reserve chute, without protective gear, at night, over Indiana. Unlike Cooper, who appeared to be familiar with parachutes, McNally had to be shown how to put on his parachute. Additionally, McNally's pilot increased the airspeed to 320 knots, 590 km per hour, nearly twice the airspeed of Flight 305 at the time of Cooper's jump. The increased wind speed caused a violent jump for McNally. The money bag was immediately torn from him, yet he had landed unharmed except for some superficial scratches and bruises. Hahnman hijacked a 727 in Pennsylvania and survived after jumping at night into a Honduran jungle. The third copycat, LaPointe, hijacked a 727 in Nevada. Wearing only trousers, a shirt and cowboy boots, LaPointe jumped into the freezing January wind over northern Colorado and landed in the snow. The survival of the copycats forced Himmelsbach to reevaluate his opinions and theories regarding Cooper's chances for survival. In 2008, Himmelsbach admitted he originally thought Cooper had only a 50% chance of survival, but subsequently revised his assessment, leading some investigators to theorize Cooper survived but lost the ransom during the jump. By 1976, most published legal analyses concurred the impending expiration of the statute of limitations for prosecution of the hijacker would make little difference. Since the statute's interpretation varies from case to case and from court to court, a prosecutor could argue Cooper had forfeited legal immunity on any of several valid technical grounds. In November 1976, a Portland grand jury returned an indictment in absentia against John Doe, a.k.a. Dan Cooper, for air piracy and violation of the Hobbs Act. The indictment formally enabled prosecution to be continued, should the hijacker be apprehended at any time in the future. Ted Braden. Theodore Burdett Braden Jr., 1928–2007, was a United States Special Forces commando during the Vietnam War, master skydiver and convicted felon. He was believed by many within the Special Forces community, both at the time of the hijacking and during subsequent years, to have been Cooper. Born in Ohio, Braden first joined the military in 1944 at the age of 16, serving with the 101st Airborne during World War II. He eventually became one of the military's best parachutists, often representing the United States Army Air Force in international skydiving tournaments, and his military records list him as having made 911 jumps. During the 1960s, Braden was a team leader within the Military Assistance Command, Vietnam, Studies and Observations Group, MACVSOG, a classified commando unit of Green Berets which performed unconventional warfare operations in Vietnam. He also served as a military skydiving instructor, teaching halo jumping techniques to members of Project Delta. Braden spent 23 months in Vietnam, conducting classified operations within both North and South Vietnam, as well as Laos and Cambodia. In December 1966, Braden deserted his unit in Vietnam and made his way to the Congo to serve as a mercenary, but only served there a brief time before being arrested by CIA agents and taken back to the U.S. for a court-martial. Despite having committed a capital offense by deserting in wartime, Braden was given an honorable discharge and prohibited from re-enlisting in the military in exchange for his continued secrecy about the MACVSOG program. Braden was profiled in the October 1967 issue of Ramparts magazine, wherein he was described by fellow Special Forces veteran and journalist Donald W. Duncan as being someone with a secret death wish, who continually places himself in unnecessary danger but always seems to get away with it, specifically referring to Braden's disregard for military skydiving safety regulations. Duncan also claimed that during Braden's time in Vietnam, he was continuously involved in shady deals to make money. Little is known of Braden's life after his 1967 discharge, but at the time of the hijacking he was a truck driver for Consolidated Freightways, which was headquartered in Vancouver, Washington, just across the Columbia River from Portland and not far from Cooper's suspected drop zone in Ariel, Washington. It is also known that he was investigated, but never charged, by the FBI in the early 1970s for stealing $250,000 in a trucking scam he had allegedly devised. In 1980, Braden was indicted by a federal grand jury for driving an 18-wheeler full of stolen goods from Arizona to Massachusetts, but it is unknown whether there was a conviction in that case. Braden was arrested in Pennsylvania 2 years later for driving a stolen vehicle with fictitious plates and for having no driver's license. Braden was eventually sent to federal prison during the late 1980s, serving time in Pennsylvania, but the precise crime is unknown. Despite his ability as a soldier, Braden was not well liked personally and was described by a family member as the perfect combination of high intelligence and criminality. From his time working covert operations in Vietnam, he likely would have possessed the then classified knowledge about the ability and proper specifications for jumping from a Boeing 727, perhaps having done it himself on MACVSOG missions. Physically, Braden's military records list him at 5 feet 8 in 173 centimeters, which is shorter than the height description of at least 5 feet 10 in 178 centimeters, given by the two flight attendants, but this military measurement would have been taken in his stocking feet and he may have appeared somewhat taller in shoes. However, Braden possessed a dark complexion from years of outdoor military service, had short dark hair, a medium athletic build and was 43 years of age at the time of the hijacking, which are features all in line with the descriptions of Cooper. Kenneth Christensen. In 2003, Minnesota resident Lyle Christensen watched a television documentary about the Cooper hijacking and became convinced that his late brother Kenneth, 1926 to 1994, was Cooper. After repeated futile attempts to convince the FBI as well as author and movie director Nora Ephron, who he hoped would make a movie about the case, Lyle contacted private investigator Skip Porteous in New York City. In 2010, Porteous published a book postulating that Christensen was the hijacker. The next year, an episode of the history series Brad Meltzer's Decoded summarized the circumstantial evidence linking Kenneth Christensen to the Cooper case. Christensen enlisted in the United States Army in 1944 and was trained as a paratrooper. World War II had ended by the time he was deployed in 1945, but he made occasional training jumps while stationed in Allied-occupied Japan during the late 1940s. After leaving the Army, he joined Northwest Orient Airlines in 1954 as a laborer stationed at the company's Far East stopover on Simia Island in the Aleutians. He subsequently became a flight attendant, and then a purser, based in Seattle. Christensen was 45 years old at the time of the hijacking, but he was shorter, 5 feet 8 in or 173 centimeters, and thinner, 150 pounds or 68 kilograms, than eyewitness descriptions of Cooper. Christensen smoked, as did the hijacker, and displayed a fondness for bourbon, the drink Cooper had requested. Stewardess Florence Schaffner told author Jeffrey Gray that photos of Christensen fit her memory of the hijacker's appearance more closely than those of the other suspects she had been shown, but added that she could not conclusively identify him. Despite the publicity generated by Porteous's book and the television documentary, the FBI maintains that Christensen cannot be considered a prime suspect. It cites the poor match to eyewitness physical descriptions and a complete absence of direct incriminating evidence. Jack Coffe, Bryant, Jack Coffe, 1917 to 1975, was a con man, ex-convict and purported government informant who claimed to have been the chauffeur and confidant of Abraham Lincoln's last undisputed descendant, great-grandson Robert Todd Lincoln Beckwith. In 1972, Coffe began claiming he was Cooper and attempted through an intermediary, a former cellmate named James Brown, to sell his story to a Hollywood production company. Coffe claimed he had landed near Mount Hood, about 50 miles, 80 kilometers, southeast of Ariel, injuring himself and losing the ransom money in the process. Photos of Coffe bear a resemblance to the composite drawings, although he was in his mid-50s in 1971. He was reportedly in Portland on the day of the hijacking and sustained leg injuries around that time which were consistent with a skydiving mishap. Coffe's account was reviewed by the FBI, which concluded that it differed in several details from information that had not been made public and was therefore a fabrication. Brown continued peddling the story long after Coffe died in 1975. Multiple media venues, including the CBS News program 60 Minutes, considered and rejected the story. Lynn Cooper, Lynn Doyle, L.D. Cooper, 1931 to 1999, a leather worker and Korean War veteran, was proposed as a suspect in July 2011 by his niece, Marla Cooper. As an 8-year-old, she recalled Cooper and another uncle planning something very mischievous, involving the use of expensive walkie-talkies, at her grandmother's house in Sisters, Oregon, 150 miles, 240 kilometers, southeast of Portland. The next day Flight 305 was hijacked, and though the uncles ostensibly were turkey hunting, L.D. Cooper came home wearing a bloody shirt, the result, he said, of an auto accident. Later, Marla claimed, her parents came to believe that L.D. was the hijacker. She also recalled that her uncle, who died in 1999, was obsessed with the Canadian comic book hero Dan Cooper and had one of his comic books thumbtacked to his wall, although he was not a skydiver or paratrooper. In August 2011, New York Magazine published an alternative witness sketch, reportedly based on a description by Flight 305 eyewitness Robert Gregory, depicting horn-rimmed sunglasses, a russet-colored suit jacket with wide lapels and marcelled hair. The article observed that L.D. Cooper had wavy hair that looked marcelled, as did Dwayne Weber, see below. The FBI announced that no fingerprints had been found on a guitar strap made by L.D. Cooper. 1 week later, they added that his DNA did not match the partial DNA profile obtained from the hijacker's tie, but acknowledged that there is no certainty that the hijacker was the source of the organic material obtained from the tie. Barbara Dayton, 1926 to 2002, a recreational pilot and University of Washington librarian who was named Robert Dayton at birth, served in the U.S. Merchant Marine and then the U.S. Army during World War II. After discharge, Dayton worked with explosives for construction work and aspired to a professional airline career, but could not obtain a commercial pilot's license. Dayton had gender reassignment surgery in 1969, and changed her name to Barbara. She is believed to be the first person to have had this type of surgery in Washington. Dayton claimed to have staged the hijacking 2 years later, presenting as a man, in order to get back at the airline industry and the FAA, whose insurmountable rules and conditions had prevented her from becoming an airline pilot. Dayton said that the ransom money was hidden in a cistern near Woodburn, Oregon, a suburban area south of Portland. She eventually recanted the entire story, ostensibly after learning that hijacking charges could still be brought. She also did not match the physical description particularly closely. William Gossett, William Pratt Gossett, 1930 to 2003, was a Marine Corps, Army and Army Air Force veteran who had military service in Korea and Vietnam. His military experience included jump training and wilderness survival. Gossett was known to be obsessed with the Cooper hijacking. According to Galen Cook, a lawyer who has collected information related to Gossett for years, he once showed his sons a key to a Vancouver, British Columbia, safe deposit box which, he claimed, contained the long-missing ransom money. The FBI has no direct evidence implicating Gossett and cannot reliably place him in the Pacific Northwest at the time of the hijacking. There is not one link to the D.B. Cooper case, said Special Agent Carr, other than the statements Gossett made to someone. Joe Lockach. Joe Lockach, 1921–2017, was a retired U.S. Army major and Korean War veteran whose daughter Susan Giff was killed less than 2 months before the hijacking, as a consequence of a botched hostage negotiation conducted by the FBI. The events culminating in the death of Lockach's daughter would be studied by hostage negotiators for decades as an example of what not to do during a hostage situation. He and his wife later sued the FBI, and ultimately an appeals court ruled in their favor, holding that the FBI acted negligently during the hostage negotiation. Lockach would become a Cooper suspect in large part due to the revelation that Cooper's tie contained microscopic particles of uncommon metals, such as unalloyed titanium. It is speculated that few people during that era would have contact with such materials, and that Cooper may have worked in a manufacturing environment working on electronics as engineer or manager. When the hijacking occurred, Lockach was working in Nashville as a production supervisor at an electronics capacitor factory and would have likely been exposed to the materials found on the tie. When Cooper was asked by Tina Mucklow why he was committing the hijacking, he replied, "It's not because I have a grudge against your airlines, it's just because I have a grudge." It is believed by some that this grudge was Lockach's anger toward the FBI for their failed efforts at rescuing his daughter less than 2 months earlier. 1 month after the hijacking, the FBI distributed lists of the ransom serial numbers to financial institutions, casinos, racetracks, businesses with routine transactions involving large amounts of cash, and to law enforcement agencies around the world. Northwest Orient Airlines offered a reward of 15% of the recovered money, to a maximum of $25,000. In early 1972, United States Attorney General John N. Mitchell released the serial numbers to the general public. 2 men used counterfeit $20 bills printed with Cooper serial numbers to swindle $30,000 from a Newsweek reporter named Carl Fleming in exchange for an interview with a man they falsely claimed was the hijacker. In early 1973, with the ransom money still missing, the Oregon Journal republished the serial numbers and offered $1,000, equivalent to $7,083 in 2024, to the first person to turn in a ransom bill to the newspaper or any FBI field office. In Seattle, the Post-Intelligencer made a similar offer with a $5,000 reward. The offers remained in effect until Thanksgiving 1974, although, despite several near matches reported, no genuine bills were found. In 1975, Northwest Orient Airlines' insurer, Global Indemnity Company, complied with an order from the Minnesota Supreme Court and paid the airlines $180,000, equivalent to $1,100,000 in 2024, claim on the ransom money. Analysis of the flight data indicated the first estimated location of Cooper's landing zone was inaccurate. Captain Scott, who was flying the aircraft manually because of Cooper's speed and altitude demands, determined the flight path was farther east than initially reported. Additional data provided by Continental Airlines pilot Tom Bohan, who was flying 4 minutes behind Flight 305, led the FBI to recalculate their estimates for Cooper's drop zone. Bohan noted the FBI's calculations for Cooper's drop zone were based on incorrectly recorded wind direction, and therefore the FBI's estimates were inaccurate. Based on Bohan's data and subsequent recalculations of the flight path, the FBI determined Cooper's drop zone was probably over the Washougal River watershed. In 1986, FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach wrote, "I have to confess, if I were going to look for Cooper, I would head for the Washougal. The Washougal Valley and the surrounding areas have been repeatedly searched, but no discoveries traceable to the hijacking have been reported, and the FBI believes any remaining physical clues were probably destroyed in the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens." Analysis of the flight data indicated the first estimated location of Cooper's landing zone was inaccurate. Captain Scott, who was flying the aircraft manually because of Cooper's speed and altitude demands, determined the flight path was farther east than initially reported. Additional data provided by Continental Airlines pilot Tom Bohan, who was flying 4 minutes behind Flight 305, led the FBI to recalculate their estimates for Cooper's drop zone. Bohan noted the FBI's calculations for Cooper's drop zone were based on incorrectly recorded wind direction, and therefore the FBI's estimates were inaccurate. Based on Bohan's data and subsequent recalculations of the flight path, the FBI determined Cooper's drop zone was probably over the Washougal River watershed. In 1986, FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach wrote, "I have to confess, if I were going to look for Cooper, I would head for the Washougal. The Washougal Valley and the surrounding areas have been repeatedly searched, but no discoveries traceable to the hijacking have been reported, and the FBI believes any remaining physical clues were probably destroyed in the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens." During their forensic search of the aircraft, FBI agents found 4 major pieces of evidence, each with a direct physical link to Cooper. A black clip-on tie, a mother-of-pearl tie clip, a hair from Cooper's headrest and 8 filter-tipped Raleigh cigarette butts from the armrest ashtray. FBI agents found a black clip-on necktie in seat 18E, where Cooper had been seated. Attached to the tie was a gold tie clip with a circular mother-of-pearl setting in the center of the clip. The FBI determined the tie had been sold exclusively at JCPenney department stores but had been discontinued in 1968. By late 2007, the FBI had built a partial DNA profile from samples found on Cooper's tie in 2001. However, the FBI also acknowledged no evidence linked Cooper to the source of the DNA sample. FBI Special Agent Fred Gutt said, "The tie had 2 small DNA samples and 1 large sample. It's difficult to draw firm conclusions from these samples." The FBI also made public a file of previously unreleased evidence, including Cooper's airline ticket, composite sketches and fact sheets, and posted a request for information about Cooper's identification. In March 2009, a group of citizen sleuths, using GPS, satellite imagery and other technologies unavailable in 1971, began reinvestigating components of the case. Known as the Cooper Research Team, CRT, the group included paleontologist Tom Kay from the Burke Museum of Natural History and Culture in Seattle, scientific illustrator Carol Abrachinskas, computer scientist Sean Christo and metallurgist Alan Stone. Although the CRT obtained little new information about the buried ransom money or Cooper's landing zone, they found, analyzed and identified hundreds of organic and metallic particles on Cooper's tie. Using electron microscopy, the CRT identified lycopodium spores, the source of which was likely pharmaceutical. The team also found minute particles of unalloyed titanium on the tie, along with particles of bismuth, antimony, cerium, strontium sulfide, aluminum and titanium antimony alloys. The metal and rare earth particles suggested Cooper may have worked for Boeing or another aeronautical engineering company, at a chemical manufacturing plant or at a metal fabrication and production facility. The material with the most significance, explained Kay, was the unalloyed titanium. During the 1970s, the use of pure titanium was extremely rare and specialized, and would only be used in aircraft fabrication facilities, or at chemical companies combining titanium and aluminum to store extremely corrosive substances. Cerium and strontium sulfide were used by Boeing's Supersonic Transport Development Project and by Portland factories in which cathode ray tubes were manufactured, such as Teledyne and Tektronix. Cooper researcher Eric Ulis has speculated that the titanium antimony alloys are linked to REM Crew Titanium Inc., a metals manufacturer and Boeing contractor. FBI agents found 2 hair samples in Cooper's seat, a single strand of limb hair on the seat, and a single strand of brown Caucasian head hair on the headrest. The limb hair was destroyed after the FBI crime laboratory determined the sample lacked enough unique microscopic characteristics to be useful. However, the FBI crime laboratory determined the head hair was suitable for future comparison, and preserved the hair on a microscope slide. During their attempts to build Cooper's DNA profile in 2002, the FBI discovered the hair sample had been lost. FBI agents found 2 hair samples in Cooper's seat, a single strand of limb hair on the seat, and a single strand of brown Caucasian head hair on the headrest. The limb hair was destroyed after the FBI crime laboratory determined the sample lacked enough unique microscopic characteristics to be useful. However, the FBI crime laboratory determined the head hair was suitable for future comparison, and preserved the hair on a microscope slide. During their attempts to build Cooper's DNA profile in 2002, the FBI discovered the hair sample had been lost. In the armrest ashtray of seat 18E, FBI agents found 8 Raleigh filter-tipped cigarette butts. The butts were sent to the FBI crime laboratory, but investigators were unable to find fingerprints and returned the butts to the Las Vegas field office. In 1998, the FBI sought to extract DNA from the cigarette butts, but discovered the butts had been destroyed while in the custody of the Las Vegas field office. On February 10, 1980, 8-year-old Brian Ingram was vacationing with his family on the Columbia River at a beachfront known as Tina Bar, about 9 miles, 14 kilometers, downstream from Vancouver, Washington, and 20 miles, 32 kilometers, southwest of Ariel. As he raked the sandy riverbank to build a campfire, he uncovered 3 packets of the ransom cash, totaling about $5,800. The bills had disintegrated from lengthy exposure to the elements, but were still bundled in rubber bands. FBI technicians confirmed the money was indeed a portion of the ransom. 2 packets of $120 bills each, and a third packet of $90, all arranged in the same order as when given to Cooper. The discovery caused new conjecture and ultimately raised more questions than it answered. Initial statements by investigators and scientific consultants were founded on the assumption the bundled bills washed freely into the Columbia River from one of its many connecting tributaries. An Army Corps of Engineers hydrologist noted the bills had disintegrated in a rounded fashion and were matted together, indicating they had been deposited by river action, as opposed to having been buried deliberately. The finding supported the hypothesis Cooper had landed near the Washougal River, which merges with the Columbia upstream from the discovery site, and not in or near Lake Merwin, the Lewis River or any of its tributaries feeding the Columbia River downstream from Tina Bar. The free-floating hypothesis neither explained the 10 bills missing from one packet, nor explained how the 3 packets remained together after separating from the rest of the money. Physical evidence was incompatible with geological evidence. Himmelsbach wrote free-floating bundles would have washed up on the bank within a couple of years of the hijacking. Otherwise, the rubber bands would have long since deteriorated. Geological evidence suggested the bills arrived at Tina Bar after 1974, when the Army Corps of Engineers performed a dredging operation on a nearby section of the river. Geologist Leonard Palmer of Portland State University found 2 distinct layers of sand and sediment between the clay deposited on the riverbank by the dredge and the sand layer in which the bills were buried, indicating the bills arrived long after dredging had been completed. In late 2020, analysis of diatoms found on the bills suggests the bundles found at Tina Bar were not submerged in the river or buried dry at the time of the hijacking in November 1971. Only diatoms that bloom during springtime were found, indicating the money had entered the water at least several months after the hijacking. In 1986, after protracted negotiations, the recovered bills were divided equally between Brian Ingram and Northwest Orient Airlines' insurer, Royal Globe Insurance. The FBI retained 14 examples as evidence. Ingram sold 15 of his bills at auction in 2008 for about $37,000, equivalent to $54,000 in 2024. The Columbia River ransom money remains the only confirmed physical evidence from the hijacking found outside the aircraft. During the hijacking, Cooper demanded and received 2 main parachutes and 2 reserve parachutes. The 2 reserve, front parachutes were supplied by a local skydiving school and the 2 main, back, parachutes were supplied by a local pilot, Norman Hayden. Earl Coffe, the parachute rigger who packed all 4 parachutes brought to Cooper, described the 2 main parachutes as emergency bailout parachutes, as opposed to sporting parachutes used by skydivers. Coffe further described the main parachutes as being like military parachutes because they were rigged to open immediately upon the ripcord being pulled and were incapable of being steered. When the aircraft landed in Reno, FBI agents discovered 2 parachutes Cooper left behind, 1 reserve, front, parachute and 1 main, back, parachute. The reserve parachute had been opened and 3 shroud lines had been cut out, but the main parachute left behind was still intact. The unused main parachute was described by FBI agents as a model NB6, Navy Backpack 6, and is on display at the Washington State Historical Society Museum. One of the 2 reserve, front, parachutes Cooper was given was an unusable training parachute intended to only be used for classroom demonstrations. According to Coffe, the reserve parachute's internal canopy was sewn together so skydiving students could get the feel of pulling a ripcord on a packed parachute without the canopy actually deploying. This non-functional reserve parachute was not found in the aircraft when it landed in Reno, causing FBI agents to speculate Cooper was not an experienced parachutist because someone with experience would have realized this reserve parachute was a dummy parachute. However, within days of the hijacking, the FBI revealed that neither of the parachute harnesses Cooper was given had the necessary D-rings required to attach reserve parachutes. Although Cooper lacked the ability to attach this dummy parachute to his main harness as a reserve parachute, it was not found in the airplane, so what he did with it is unknown. Coffe speculated Cooper removed the sewn-together canopy and used the empty reserve container as an extra money bag. Flight attendant Tina Mucklow's testimony was in line with Coffe's speculation, stating she recalled Cooper attempting to pack money inside a parachute container. In November 1978, a deer hunter found a Boeing 727's instruction placard for lowering the aft air stair. The placard was found near a logging road about 13 miles, 21 kilometers, east of Castle Rock, Washington, north of Lake Merwin, but within Flight 305's basic flight path. During the 45-year span of its active investigation, the FBI periodically made public some of its working hypotheses and tentative conclusions, based on witness testimony and the scarce physical evidence. During the first year of the investigation, the FBI used eyewitness testimony from the passengers and flight crew to develop sketches of Cooper. The first sketch, officially titled Composite A, was completed a few days after the hijacking and was released on November 28, 1971. According to witnesses, the Composite A sketch, jokingly known as Bing Crosby, was not an accurate likeness of Cooper. The Composite A sketch, said witnesses, showed a young man with a narrow face, and did not resemble Cooper or capture his disinterested, let's get this over with look. Flight attendant Florence Schaffner repeatedly told the FBI the Composite A sketch was a very poor likeness of Cooper. After multiple eyewitnesses said Composite A was not an accurate rendering, FBI artists developed a second composite sketch. Completed in late 1972, the second Composite B sketch was intended to depict more accurately Cooper's age, skin tone and face shape. 215 eyewitnesses to whom Composite B was shown said the sketch was more accurate, but the Composite B Cooper looked too angry or nasty. One flight attendant said the Composite B sketch looked like a hoodlum and remembered Cooper as more refined in appearance. Moreover, said witnesses, the Composite B sketch depicted a man older than Cooper, with a lighter complexion. Using the criticisms of Composite B, FBI artists made adjustments and improvements to the Composite B sketch. On January 2, 1973, the FBI finalized revised Composite B, their third sketch of Cooper. Of the new sketch, one flight attendant said revised Composite B was a very close resemblance to the hijacker. Opined another flight attendant, the hijacker would be easily recognized from this sketch. In April 1973, the FBI concluded the revised Composite B sketch was the best likeness of Cooper they could develop, and should be considered the definitive sketch of Cooper. Flight attendants Schaffner and Mucklow, who spent the most time interacting with Cooper, were interviewed on the same night in separate cities and gave nearly identical descriptions. A man in his mid-40s, approximately 5 feet 10 inches, 1.78 meters, to 6 feet 0 inches, 1.83 meters, tall and 170 to 180 pounds, 77 to 82 kilogram, with olive-toned skin, brown eyes, short combed-back black hair and no discernible accent. University of Oregon student Bill Mitchell, who sat across from Cooper during the 3-hour flight, gave the FBI several interviews and provided detailed descriptions of Cooper for what subsequently became Composite Sketch B. Mitchell's descriptions of Cooper were similar to those provided by the flight attendants, except Mitchell described Cooper as 5 feet 9 inches, 1.75 meters, to 5 feet 10 inches, 1.78 meters. Since Mitchell was 6 feet 2 inches, 1.88 meters, tall, he described himself as way bigger than Cooper and referred to Cooper as slight. Robert Gregory, one of the only other passengers besides Mitchell who provided the FBI with a full description of Cooper, also described him as 5 feet 9 inches, 1.75 meters, tall. Gregory stated he believed Cooper to be of Mexican American or Native American descent. In May 1973, the FBI internally released an 8-page suspect profile of Cooper. The profile suggested Cooper was a military-trained parachutist and not a sports skydiver. In addition to his familiarity with the military parachutes with which he was provided, Cooper's age would have made him an outlier in the sports skydiving community and would have increased the likelihood of being recognized by a club member. Multiple eyewitnesses noted Cooper's athletic build, so the FBI profile suggested Cooper probably exercised regularly despite his age. FBI profilers suspected Cooper was an Air Force veteran familiar with Seattle and the surrounding areas. Cooper recognized Tacoma as the jet-circled Puget Sound, and in his conversation with Mucklow, Cooper correctly noted McChord Air Force Base's proximity to SeaTac, a detail with which most civilians would be unfamiliar. Cooper's mannerisms, such as his vocabulary, planning, his thorough retrieval of evidence and his use of aviation terminology, led the FBI to conclude he was not a common criminal. Cooper was clearly intelligent, not impulsive or easily rattled, a careful and procedure-oriented planner, adept at anticipating contingencies and adaptive strategies, with meticulous and methodical tendencies. Profilers also noted Cooper's ability to quickly and competently adapt to various situations as they arose, indicating he probably preferred to work independently and neither needed nor wanted an accomplice. Cooper's financial situation was probably desperate. According to Himmelsbach, extortionists and other criminals who steal large amounts of money nearly always do so because they need it urgently, otherwise, the crime is not worth the considerable risk. The FBI considered, but ultimately dismissed, the possibility Cooper was a thrill seeker who made the jump just to prove it could be done. Because Cooper spilled the only drink he was served and never requested another, the FBI theorized Cooper was neither a heavy drinker nor an alcoholic. Moreover, an alcoholic would likely have been incapable of refusing further alcoholic beverages throughout the stressful and lengthy hijacking. By calculating the number of cigarettes Cooper smoked throughout the hijacking, the FBI believed Cooper smoked about 1 pack of cigarettes a day. Some theorized Cooper's alias was taken from the adventure hero Dan Cooper, a fictional Royal Canadian Air Force test pilot and the main character of a popular French-language Belgian comic book series, one cover of which depicted the character skydiving. Because the Dan Cooper comics were neither translated to English nor imported to the United States, some speculated the hijacker encountered them during a European tour of duty and spoke fluent French. The fact that the Dan Cooper comics circulated in Quebec also fueled speculation that the hijacker may have been French-Canadian. The idea of Cooper being Canadian is coherent with his use of the unusual phrasing, negotiable American currency, which suggests that he had a non-US background. John List. John Emil List, 1925–2008, was an accountant and war veteran who murdered his wife, 3 teenage children, and 85-year-old mother in Westfield, New Jersey, 15 days before the Cooper hijacking, withdrew $200,000 from his mother's bank account, and disappeared. He came to the attention of the Cooper task force due to the timing of his disappearance, multiple matches to the hijacker's description, and the reasoning that a fugitive accused of mass murder has nothing to lose. After his capture in 1989, List denied any involvement in the Cooper hijacking. No substantial evidence implicates him, and the FBI no longer considers him a suspect. List died in prison in 2008. Ted Mayfield. Theodore Ernest Mayfield, 1935–2015, was a Special Forces veteran, pilot, competitive skydiver, and skydiving instructor. He served prison time in 1994 for negligent homicide after 2 of his students died when their parachutes failed to open, and was later found indirectly responsible for 13 additional skydiving deaths due to faulty equipment and training. In 2010, he was sentenced to 3 years probation for piloting an airplane 26 years after losing his pilot's license and rigging certificates. He was suggested repeatedly as a suspect early in the investigation, according to FBI agent Ralph Himmelsbach, who knew Mayfield from a prior dispute at a local airport. He was ruled out, based partly on the fact that he telephoned Himmelsbach less than 2 hours after Flight 305 landed in Reno to volunteer advice on standard skydiving practices and possible landing zones, as well as information on local skydivers. Richard McCoy. Richard McCoy Jr., 1942–1974, was an Army veteran who served 2 tours of duty in Vietnam, first as a demolition expert and later with the Green Berets as a helicopter pilot. After his military service, he became a warrant officer in the Utah National Guard and an avid recreational skydiver, with aspirations of becoming a Utah State Trooper. On April 7, 1972, McCoy staged the best-known of the copycat hijackings. He boarded United Airlines Flight 855, a Boeing 727 with aft stairs, in Denver, Colorado, and, brandishing what later proved to be a paperweight resembling a hand grenade and an unloaded pistol, he demanded 4 parachutes and $500,000. After delivery of the money and parachutes at San Francisco International Airport, McCoy ordered the aircraft back into the sky and bailed out over Provo, Utah, leaving behind his handwritten hijacking instructions and his fingerprints on a magazine he had been reading. He was arrested on April 9 with the ransom cash in his possession and, after trial and conviction, received a 45-year sentence. 2 years later, he escaped from Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary with several accomplices by crashing a garbage truck through the main gate. Tracked down 3 months later in Virginia Beach, McCoy was killed in a shootout with FBI agents. In their 1991 book, D.B. Cooper, The Real McCoy, parole officer Bernie Rhodes and former FBI agent Russell Kalami asserted that they had identified McCoy as Cooper. They cited obvious similarities in the 2 hijackings, claims by McCoy's family that the tie and mother-of-pearl tie clip left on the airplane belonged to McCoy, and McCoy's own refusal to admit or deny that he was Cooper. A proponent of their claim was the FBI agent who killed McCoy. "When I shot Richard McCoy," he said, "I shot D.B. Cooper at the same time." Although there is no reasonable doubt that McCoy committed the Denver hijacking, the FBI does not skydiving skill much greater than thought to be possessed by the hijacker, and credible evidence that McCoy was in Las Vegas on the day of the Portland hijacking, and at home in Utah the day after, having Thanksgiving dinner with his family. In addition, all 3 of the stewardesses from the Cooper hijacking were shown photographs of McCoy and agreed that he was not their hijacker. They were even able to point to specific differences in the two men, specifically that Cooper's nose wasn't as broad as McCoy's, that Cooper had more hair than McCoy, and that Cooper's ears did not protrude as much as McCoy's. McCoy's photo was also shown to the ticket agent who sold Cooper his ticket, the gate agent, and the passenger seated closest to Cooper, Bill Mitchell, and they too concluded that McCoy and Cooper were not the same. In 2024, McCoy's two children publicly stated that their father had been D.B. Cooper after a parachute was found by YouTuber Dan Grider on the property formerly owned by McCoy's mother. Grider claims to have handed this parachute over to the FBI, though the FBI has not confirmed this. Sheridan Peterson, 1926 to 2021, served with the Marine Corps during World War II and was employed later as a technical editor at Boeing, based in Seattle. Investigators became interested in Peterson as a suspect soon after the skyjacking because of his experience as a smoke jumper and love of taking physical risks, as well as his similar appearance and age, 44, to the Cooper description. His involvement in the civil rights movement and assisting refugees in Vietnam during the Vietnam War could have potentially radicalized him to pursue hijacking. Peterson often teased the media about whether he was really Cooper. Entrepreneur Eric Ulis, who spent years investigating the crime, said he was 98% convinced that Peterson was Cooper. When pressed by FBI agents, Peterson insisted he was in Nepal at the time of the hijacking. He died in 2021. In an episode of History Channel's History's Greatest Mysteries, analysis of DNA found on the tie worn by Cooper indicated that Peterson was not a match for Cooper when compared to a DNA sample from one of Peterson's living daughters. Eric Ulis has since withdrawn his allegation that Peterson could have been Cooper. Robert Rackstraw, Robert Wesley Rackstraw, 1943 to 2019, was a retired pilot and ex-convict who served on an Army helicopter crew and other units during the Vietnam War. He came to the attention of the Cooper Task Force in February 1978, after he was arrested in Iran and deported to the U.S. to face explosives possession and check-kiting charges. Several months later, while released on bail, Rackstraw attempted to fake his own death by radioing a false mayday call and telling controllers that he was bailing out of a rented airplane over Monterey Bay. Police later arrested him in Fullerton, California, on an additional charge of forging federal pilot certificates. The airplane he claimed to have ditched was found, repainted, in a nearby hangar. Cooper investigators noted his physical resemblance to Cooper composite sketches even though he was only 28 in 1971, military parachute training, and criminal record, but eliminated him as a suspect in 1979 after no direct evidence of his involvement could be found. In 2016, Rackstraw was featured as a suspect by a History Channel program, along with a book. On September 8, 2016, Thomas J. Colbert, the author of the book, and attorney Mark Zaid filed a lawsuit to compel the FBI to release its Cooper case file by the Freedom of Information Act. In 2017, Colbert and a group of volunteer investigators uncovered what they believed to be a decades-old parachute strap at an undisclosed location in the Pacific Northwest. This was followed later in 2017 with a piece of foam, which they suspected was part of Cooper's parachute backpack. In January 2018, Tom and Donna Colbert reported that they had obtained a confession letter originally written in December 1971 containing codes that matched 3 units Rackstraw was a part of while in the Army. One of the Flight 305 flight attendants reportedly did not find any similarities between photos of Rackstraw from the 1970s and her recollection of Cooper's appearance. Rackstraw's attorney termed the renewed allegations the stupidest thing I've ever heard, and Rackstraw himself told People magazine, "It's a lot of expletive, and they know it is." The FBI declined further comment. Rackstraw stated in a 2017 phone interview that he lost his job over the 2016 investigations. Rackstraw said to Colbert, "I told everybody I was the hijacker," before explaining the admission was a stunt. He died in 2019. Walter Recca, Walter R. Recca, 1933 to 2014, was a former military paratrooper and intelligence operative. He was proposed as a suspect by his friend Carl Lauren in 2018. In 2008, Recca told Lauren via a recorded telephone call that he was the hijacker. Recca gave Lauren permission in a notarized letter to share his story after his death. He also allowed Lauren to tape their telephone conversations about the crime during a 6-week period in late 2008. In over 3 hours of recordings, Recca shared details about his version of the hijacking. He also confessed to his niece, Lisa's story. From Recca's description of the terrain on his way to the drop zone, Lauren concluded that he landed near Cle Elum, Washington. After Recca described an encounter with a dump truck driver at a roadside cafe after he landed, Lauren located Jeff Osiadich, who was driving his dump truck near Cle Elum the night of the hijacking and met a stranger at the Teanaway Junction Cafe just outside of town. The man asked Osiadich to give his friend directions to the cafe by telephone, presumably to be picked up, and he complied. Lauren convinced Joe Koenig, a former member of the Michigan State Police, of Rekha's guilt. Koenig later published a book on Cooper, titled Getting the Truth, IMDb Cooper. These claims have aroused skepticism. Cle Elum is well north and east of Flight 305's known flight path, more than 150 miles, 240 kilometers, north of the drop zone assumed by most analysts, and even further from Tina Bar, where a portion of the ransom money was found. Rekha was a military paratrooper and private skydiver with hundreds of jumps to his credit, in contradiction to the FBI's publicized profile of an amateur skydiver at best. Rekha also did not resemble the composite portrait the FBI assembled, which Lauren and Osiadich used to explain why Osiadic's suspicions were not aroused at the time. In response to the allegations against Rekha, the FBI said that it would be inappropriate to comment on specific tips provided to them, and that no evidence to date had proved the culpability of any suspect beyond a reasonable doubt. William Smith. In November 2018, The Oregonian published an article proposing William J. Smith, 1928-2018, of Bloomfield, New Jersey, 259, as a suspect. The article was based on research conducted by an Army data analyst who sent his findings to the FBI in mid-2018. Smith, a New Jersey native, was a World War II veteran. After high school, he enlisted with the United States Navy and volunteered for combat aircrew training. After his discharge, he worked for the Lehigh Valley Railroad and was affected by the Penn Central Transportation Company's bankruptcy in 1970, the largest bankruptcy in U.S. history at that time. The article proposed that the loss of his pension created a grudge against the corporate establishment and transportation field, as well as a sudden need for money. Smith was 43 at the time of the hijacking. In his high school yearbook, a list of alumni killed in World War II lists an Ira Daniel Cooper, possibly the source for the hijacker's pseudonym. The analyst claimed that Smith's naval aviation experience would have given him knowledge of airplanes and parachutes, and his railroad experience would have helped him find railroad tracks and hop on a train to escape the area after landing. According to the analyst, aluminum spiral chips found on the clip-on tie could have come from a locomotive maintenance facility. Smith's information about the Seattle area may have come from his close friend Dan Clare, who was stationed at Fort Lewis during the war. The analyst noted that the man who claimed to be Cooper in Max Gunther's 1985 book identified himself as Dan Leckler. Smith and Clare worked together for Conrail at Newark's Oak Island Yard. Smith retired from that facility as a yardmaster. The article noted that a picture of Smith on the Lehigh Valley Railroad website showed a remarkable resemblance to Cooper FBI sketches. The FBI said that it would be inappropriate to comment on tips related to Smith. Dwayne Weber. Dwayne L. Weber, 1924-1995, was a World War II Army veteran who served time in at least 6 prisons from 1945 to 1968 for burglary and forgery. He was proposed as a suspect by his widow, Jo, based primarily on a deathbed confession. 3 days before he died in 1995, Weber told his wife, "I am Dan Cooper." The name meant nothing to her, she said, but months later, a friend told her of its significance in the hijacking. She went to her local library to research Cooper, found Max Gunther's book, and discovered notations in the margins in her husband's handwriting. Like the hijacker, Weber drank bourbon and chain-smoked. Other circumstantial evidence included a 1979 trip to Seattle and the Columbia River, where his wife remembered him throwing a trash bag just upstream of Tina Bar. Himmelsbach said, "Weber does fit the physical description, and does have the criminal background that I have always felt was associated with the case, but did not believe Weber was Cooper." The FBI eliminated Weber as an active suspect in July 1998 when his fingerprints did not match any of those processed in the hijacked plane, and no other direct evidence could be found to implicate him. Later, his DNA also failed to match the samples recovered from Cooper's tie. Cooper was among the first to attempt air piracy for personal gain. 11 days before Cooper's hijack, Canadian Paul Joseph Sini had hijacked an Air Canada DC-8 over Montana, but was overpowered by the crew when he put down his shotgun to strap on his parachute. Encouraged by Cooper's apparent success, 15 similar hijackings, all unsuccessful, were attempted in 1972. Some examples from that year. Richard Charles LaPointe, an Army veteran from Boston, boarded Hughes Air West Flight 800 at McCarran International Airport in Las Vegas on January 20. Brandishing what he claimed was a bomb while the DC-9 was on the taxiway, He demanded $50,000, 2 parachutes, and a helmet. After releasing the 51 passengers and 2 flight attendants, he ordered the airplane on an eastward trajectory toward Denver, then bailed out over the treeless plains of northeastern Colorado. Authorities, tracking the locator-equipped parachute and his footprints in the snow and mud, apprehended him a few hours later. Richard McCoy Jr., a former Army Green Beret, hijacked a United Airlines 727-100 on April 7 after it left Denver, diverted it to San Francisco, then bailed out over Utah with $500,000 in ransom money. He landed safely and was arrested 2 days later. Frederick Hahnman used a handgun to hijack an Eastern Airlines 727 in Allentown, Pennsylvania, on May 7, demanded $303,000, and eventually parachuted into his native Honduras. A month later, with the FBI in pursuit and a $25,000 bounty on his head, he surrendered at the American Embassy in Tegucigalpa. After being given a life sentence in September 1972, he was paroled in 1984. Rob Hetty, a 22-year-old former Army paratrooper, hijacked United Airlines Flight 239 from Reno to San Francisco on June 2, 1972. Carrying his own parachute and using a .357, 9.07mm revolver, he demanded $200,000 in ransom money. He jumped from the airplane and was captured the next morning. Martin McNally, an unemployed service station attendant, used a submachine gun on June 23 to commandeer an American Airlines 727 en route from St. Louis, Missouri, to Tulsa, Oklahoma, then diverted it eastward to Indiana and bailed out with $500,000 in ransom. McNally lost the ransom money as he exited the aircraft, but landed safely near Peru, Indiana, and was apprehended a few days later in a Detroit suburb. When interviewed in a 2020 podcast retrospective, McNally said he had been inspired by Cooper. With the advent of universal luggage searches in 1973, see airport security, the general incidence of hijackings dropped dramatically. There were no further notable Cooper imitators until July 11, 1980, when Glenn K. Tripp seized Northwest Orient Flight 608 at Seattle-Tacoma Airport, demanding $600,000, $100,000 by an independent account, 2 parachutes, and the assassination of his boss. A quick-thinking flight attendant drugged Tripp's alcoholic drink with Valium. After a 10-hour standoff, during which Tripp reduced his demands to 3 cheeseburgers and a ground vehicle in which to escape, he was apprehended. Tripp attempted to hijack the same Northwest flight on January 21, 1983, and this time demanded to be flown to Afghanistan. When the airplane landed in Portland, he was shot and killed by FBI agents. Despite the initiation of the Federal Sky Marshal program the previous year, 31 hijackings were committed in U.S. airspace in 1972. 19 of them were for the specific purpose of extorting money. In 1/5 of the extortion cases, the hijackers also demanded parachutes. In early 1973, the FAA began requiring airlines to search all passengers and their bags. Amid multiple lawsuits charging that such searches violated Fourth Amendment protections against search and seizure, federal courts ruled that they were acceptable when applied universally and when limited to searches for weapons and explosives. Only 2 hijackings were attempted in 1973, both by psychiatric patients. One hijacker, Samuel Bick, intended to crash the airliner into the White House to kill President Nixon. Due to multiple copycat hijackings in 1972, the FAA required that the exterior of all Boeing 727 aircraft be fitted with a spring-loaded device, later dubbed the Cooper vane, that prevents lowering of the aft air stair during flight. The device consists of a flat blade of aluminum mounted on a pivot, which is spring-loaded to stay out of the way of the door when the craft is at rest, but aerodynamically rotates into position to prevent the door from being opened when the airplane is traveling at flight speeds. Operation of the vane is automatic and cannot be overridden from within the aircraft. As a direct result of the hijacking, the installation of peepholes was mandated in all cockpit doors. This enables the cockpit crew to observe passengers without opening the cockpit door. In 1978, the hijacked 727-100 aircraft was sold by Northwest Orient to Piedmont Airlines, where it was re-registered N838N and continued in domestic carrier service. In 1984, it was purchased by the charter company Key Airlines, re-registered N29 kA, and incorporated into the Air Force's civilian charter fleet that shuttled workers between Nellis Air Force Base and the Tonopah Test Range during the F-117 Nighthawk development program. In 1996, the aircraft was scrapped for parts in a Memphis aircraft boneyard. The flight crew praised Mucklow for her actions. Mucklow continued to fly for the airline for several years. She lived privately and has only granted a few interviews since 2021. Himmelsbach famously termed Cooper a rotten sleazy crook, but his bold and unusual crime inspired a cult following that was expressed in song, movies, and literature. Novelty shops sold T-shirts emblazoned with D.B. Cooper, where are you? Restaurants and bowling alleys in the Pacific Northwest hold regular Cooper-themed promotions and sell tourist souvenirs. A Cooper Day celebration has been held at the Ariel General Store and Tavern each November since 1974 with the exception of 2015, the year its owner, Donna Elliott, died. An annual convention, known as CooperCon, is held every year in late November in Seattle, Washington. The event, founded by Cooper researcher Eric Ulis in 2018, is a multi-day gathering of Cooper researchers and enthusiasts. Originally held in Vancouver, Washington, it was relocated to Seattle beginning in 2023. CooperCon replaced the annual D.B. Cooper Days, which ended when the owner of the Ariel Store pub died and the pub was forced to close. In mid-2024, a themed bar named D.B. Cooper's opened in Hell's Kitchen, Manhattan. The owners, Irishman Kieran Willis and Partners, designed the venue as an Irish-American sports bar and cocktail lounge, featuring decor inspired by the 1971 hijacking, photos, newspaper clippings, and themed T-shirts. The bar also serves signature cocktails such as the Flight 305, pear vodka, pear nectar, blackberry, and lemon, and offers a bar drink called Skyjack among its menu. The bar is regularly noted in media coverage for its nods to the D.B. Cooper mystery and for catering to both locals and tourists.